Hello, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolin with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is a special evening edition of the show for Wednesday, August 17th, 2022. And on this episode, I've got the latest annual report on enforcement numbers and enforcement actions from the ATF for the 2021 fiscal year. Well, the ATF shouldn't even exist, but they're doing stuff, and we want to make sure that you guys are aware of what's going on. I'm a silver lining kind of guy, and I really have struggled to find a silver lining in this one. The numbers are not the worst in history, and one might expect that they would be. And in general, I'm like, well, it could be worse, but they're pretty darn close to the worst in history. And Joe and his team of gun grabbers, well, they're certainly trying to take the title. And I think the way that they're ramping things up, if they don't get it in the next year, they certainly will very soon. I'll get to all that important information in just a moment, but first of all, a quick hello and a huge thank you to everyone joining me here today, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I can't thank you enough. I'm going to look over in the live chat while we allow people a moment to or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream. And I also want to quick mention that if you are just joining us for the first time, we regularly broadcast 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But yesterday and this week, I've got some great friends who are in from out of town, and I did not have a chance to prep for the show yesterday, so I decided to do it in the evening and have a little fun this way. Anyways, so hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Tim Martin, Liberty Revolutionary, Chariton Farmer, Missouri is in the house, Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana, Mr. South Coastal Salt, Dixie Strong in Bama, and Israel in Colorado, Vamai, Lefty, White Space Marines, Guneye, Lisa Believe, Happy Snowfish, Vincent Q in Tampa. Good to see you, buddy. Bonehead, Jennifer, and everyone else. I apologize if I missed anyone. I'm just going to scroll through real quick right now. But please do continue leaving some comments or questions. I'm going to see if I can answer some of them a little bit later in the show. Otherwise, I do read through them the next 24 hours or so after the broadcast is done. I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes from your feedback. There's also Retired Senior Chief, and I think I got everybody else out there today. Thank you guys for being with me this evening. But let's start out with an important foundation. It's so essential to start with the Constitution as the founders and ratifiers understood it. And the essential thing is there is no such thing as a constitutional federal gun control measure. Not one. Every federal gun control act, law, rule, regulation, order is absolutely unconstitutional, shouldn't exist, and every enforcement attempt by the ATF or local law enforcement helping the federal government is a violation not only of your natural right to self-defense and keep and bear arms, but of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. So this would include all that juicy stuff like the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments in 1986, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, the bump stock ban of 2018, and all the new stuff they're trying to throw our way this year and in the future. Here's how James Wilson put it. If I can get to my tabs here. James Wilson said, "The defense of one's self, justly called the primary law of nature, is not, nor can it be abrogated by any regulation of municipal law." So this is a founding generation leading figure, one of the first justices of the Supreme Court, a leading supporter of ratification, probably one of the top legal minds in the country at the time of the founding, trained by the great John Dickinson, saying, well, something far different than what most people say today. Or here's the great Mercy Otis Warren, the muse of the American Revolution. She said, "Self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish." And that brings us to Uncle Joe and his ATF. It's pretty awful. And here's an article that we published on this just this morning by Mike Meharry, who does an annual report on this now every single year. In 2021, the Biden administration continued a trend of aggressive federal gun control enforcement with numbers at or near record levels. And again, I tend to be a silver lining kind of dude, and at or near is definitely less bad than at than record levels, but it is so close that I can't be positive about this at all, especially knowing that they're pushing more gun control regulations on us throughout this year, and they're really, really trying to ramp it up. The number of firearms cases initiated by the ATF, Mike reports, it actually fell slightly. So the number of cases that the ATF tried to actually prosecute or get rolling fell from about 39,500 in 2020 to 37,000 last year. A small drop of less people being harassed by the unconstitutional ATF. But he said the number of cases recommended for prosecution surged almost 40%, from 8,000 in 2020 to 11,000 in 2021. These are just kind of rounded numbers. If you're really into all the numbers and all that, we have all the reference links at the bottom of Mike's article, all the stuff that I'm referencing in this episode. I will include in a blog post over on our show homepage. I publish that 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, probably closer to 1 because I'm going to want to have some dinner and watch a little TV and get to bed tonight, but somewhere around there. It's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So if you want to look through all these numbers in detail, you'll find it over there, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And this is one of the trends that I'm noticing with the current administration. Even though the number of cases that the ATF initiated went down, they really went way more aggressively for prosecution, even with a slightly smaller number. It's not even 10%, but even though they lowered it, they're trying to get more people convicted for firearms offenses, which is really bad. So it went from 8,000 in 2020 to 11,200 in 2021. And we can get the recommended for prosecution number, which is 11,224. That was actually the second worst in history. So very, very close. The worst was not even 100 more. So this is basically a record from the Biden administration's ATF. Really, really bad news. I'm sorry to share, but we got to be aware of this. I know none of you are surprised by that. You might be surprised by the record holder. Now, the number of cases that were indicted, Mike reports that the ATF got indictments in about 7,500 cases last year, which is an increase since 2020, which was at 6,900, but 2020 went down pretty significantly. And this is also the third worst in history in 2021, the 7,500 from the current administration's ATF. And then convictions, which is really the worst. Of course, anyone who's getting harassed by the ATF for a federal gun control measure, none of which should exist, this is bad enough, but the people who get convicted on this, it's even worse, certainly. The feds got convictions in just under 6,000 cases. In total, prosecutors convicted 7,900 defendants in cases brought by the ATF. Again, this is third worst in history. Third worst is absolutely terrible. This is not an improvement, not anywhere close. Now, a lot of people are just going to immediately assume, and we hear this year in and year out, especially under the previous administration. We heard this over and over and over when we pointed out that these numbers are absolutely terrible. They just immediately assume today, for example, we'll probably hear, oh, it's Team Blue, so of course it's going to be bad. The enforcement, of course, it's going to be at or near record levels, and he's going to try to make it worse and worse and worse. But I think that really is the big lie that both teams in Washington, D.C. really want you to fall for. Here's how John Jay put it. He's the first Chief Justice of the United States. He said, "The knaves and fools of this world are forever in alliance. So the people who want to attack your liberty are certainly going to, well, we'll say, work the fools over the coals and getting them to believe that maybe one side or the other isn't attacking your liberty when they are both absolutely horrible when it comes to the Second Amendment, the Constitution, and your natural right to keep and bear arms." And that's how Mike Meharry put it in his report from this morning. He said, "This isn't something limited to Uncle Joe or even just Team Blue. Both parties have utterly failed to abide by the clear restrictions in the Second Amendment. There are no exceptions to shall not be infringed. It should be pretty straightforward, but of course, people with power are always, we're warned over and over that this type of thing would happen. People who have power, as long as you give them the ability to interpret stuff, and then you just let it go rather than resisting and refusing to comply, they'll build precedents upon precedent upon precedent and continue expanding their power." Now, Mike points out that during a public appearance in 2019, so this isn't just Joe, Uncle Donnie proudly reminded us about his own gun control credentials. And Mike links to that in the article, so you'll be able to find that over at the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. But Donnie bragged that his administration not only implemented new gun control, that was the bump stock ban. Some people who are supporters of the Second Amendment of the right to keep and bear arms, they poo-pooed that. They were like, oh, that's a kiddie toy. That doesn't count. You know what? It doesn't matter who uses it. If you establish what John Dickinson said, the penman of the American Revolution, back in 1765, just before the Stamp Act was set to go into effect, he encouraged people. He had the same kind of argument by some people who wanted to just let the Stamp Act roll, because their position was, oh, it's not really that big of a deal. It's not a huge tax. It's not going to break us. Is it worth it for us to risk our neck to refuse to comply with this? And Dickinson took the absolute opposite position. And if you understand how big of a deal that is, because Dickinson was a total moderate all throughout, especially when it came to the Declaration of Independence. He wanted to hold off. He wanted to have reconciliation and all kinds of stuff. But even at this point, the moderate guy, in comparison to today, was far more aggressive, because he said if you comply with the act, you establish you're putting your own chains around your unhappy country. Why? Because you establish the detestable precedent that the people who wanted to forge your fetters have ardently wished for. And I'm just kind of paraphrasing off the top of my head, but the short version is there is no violation of the Constitution and your liberty that's too small. That's so small that you got to be like, whatever. That's a kiddie toy. I don't use a bump stock, so I'm a serious gun rights activist. So bump stock, no big deal. No, you're not a serious gun rights activist if you think it's okay to establish a precedent where they can just define an accessory as a firearm. So like today, the new people come in and now they want to redefine what is a machine gun or a pistol brace. They go after pistol braces, and they're going to keep doing this every single time. The founding generation, the old revolutionaries, warned us about establishing precedent and resisting them. Don't let them get that precedent, no matter how small you may think it may be. Anyway, so Donnie implemented new gun control with the 2018 bump stock ban, but he also conducted more federal enforcement actions than anyone in history. In fact, he has the #1 record in most of those categories that I'm talking about. He's #2 in most of those categories. And maybe Joe beat him in one of them, the one where he's the second worst. That was the recommended for prosecution. So these two are absolutely horrible. And one of them pretends to be good and the other one pretends to be terrible. And they're both, at the end of the day, they're both absolutely awful. So going a little further, so all those areas where Joe came in second or third, he got beat by Donnie. Absolutely terrible. And then some people like to try to make a different excuse. And we heard this during the previous administration, like, oh yeah, hey Bolden, that F of the BATFE, it's only one letter. So my guy who I support is probably only going after people who are doing arson, for example. But this is absolute nonsense as well. And we have the numbers from the ATF. And Mike points out that the ATF does also investigate arson, explosives, and alcohol and tobacco cases. But these make up a small percentage of the total. Last year, so the 2021 year, 92.4% of all cases were related to firearms. So less than 8% are the other. Under Trump, 92% of cases investigated by the ATF involved firearms, and it was even less under Obama at 90. So this is just a consistent thing. Basically, 90+% of the time, they're going after guns. And even worse, and we have an article from TJ Roberts that we published a couple of years ago when we were looking at this in 2020 or 2019, the 2019 numbers, people were pushing back and saying, oh, they're just going after, the worst of the worst. Mind you, the federal government isn't authorized to do gun control. So if we care about the Constitution, following the founders' view, we care about the Second Amendment, we don't want them going after people at all. If someone needs to go after them, it needs to be state and local law enforcement, not the feds, because there is no constitutional federal gun control measure. But the issue is, and TJ went through the numbers from the ATF, they give us most frequent violations that they're prosecuted for. They gave us a top 10. We've got it listed out here. I will include a link to this in the show notes, and then maybe we can do a follow-up and compare what happened under the Biden administration for this last year. I'm assuming it's very much similar because this is how it is year in and year out. Almost all of them are paperwork errors. Almost all of them. Form 4473. Those of you who know, you know what that is. It shouldn't exist. It is a violation of the Constitution and your liberty to be doing this. But TJ noted that Donnie's ATF put thousands of people behind bars due to paperwork errors. Many of these errors, he writes, mind you, are so simple that a person could have made it on accident. They go through the list. The ATF tells you. The first one was failure to obtain a completed form, ATF 4473. Number 3, failure to complete forms as indicated on instructions. Number 4, failure to record NIC's contact information on form 4473, putting people behind bars. This is what the Hamilton people did when it came to the whiskey tax and the whiskey rebellion. Part of the reason that went down was because they made it so difficult for people to follow the regulations, and primarily the people that they were targeting, a lot of them couldn't read or write. And so they went after people like that, and it caused a little different response than we get today. But these are mostly paperwork errors. And TJ points out that the most common violations are in regard to ATF F 4473, a form you fill out when you buy a gun. This form asks if you're a felon and if you're mentally fit and all the other things the government wants to know before it allows you to own a gun. Form 4473 is about requesting permission from the federal government to do something that the federal government does not have any authority to approve or deny permission from. Anyways, Mike Meharry put it like this. He said, the lesson, we can't trust anyone in Washington, D.C. to protect the right to keep and bear arms. In fact, he writes, if the government followed the Constitution, the ATF wouldn't exist. All federal gun controls are unconstitutional. Under the Constitution, there is nothing for the ATF to enforce, including all of these stupid form errors that people are getting nabbed for. So what do we do about it? First, let's think about this. They close somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 cases per year, maybe as low as 6,000. So thousands of people are really, really being hurt by this agency that shouldn't exist. This happens with state and local law enforcement assistance. So the first step that needs to be taken on a state and local level is states and their political subdivisions. They shouldn't help enforce federal gun control measures, even if a federal court says they're constitutional. We don't need to hear that the federal government tells us that a federal act is unconstitutional before, on a state and local level and on an individual level, we start saying, we don't care what your opinion is on the constitutionality of this stuff. We aren't going to help you enforce this kind of garbage. We're starting to see some moves in this direction on a state level, most prominently in Missouri with the Second Amendment Preservation Act that the DOJ is currently trying to sue them over. They are in the middle of a lawsuit. They may lose the first round because it's an unfriendly judge, but I think in the long run they're going to win that. We also have some positive moves happening in Montana, in Arizona, and a couple of other places. Most of the ones, if you hear about these things, most of the other ones are absolute fakes. But the first step is that states and their political subdivisions need to stop helping the federal government enforce this stuff. Because if they're closing 7,000 to 10,000 of them with state and local law enforcement assistance, and then they stop, partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. That's going to reduce the numbers significantly already. And then if you think a little further on this, let's say there were, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, 13 million undocumented short-barreled shotguns, all in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934, which shouldn't exist. I mean, if you think about it, if they can close 7,000 to 10,000 cases and you got 13 million undocumented ones, there is no chance these people can do anything about it. What it really gets down to, and I'm going to get to Thomas Jefferson on this in a moment, But it really gets down to people being willing to exercise their rights, whether the government wants to give them permission to or not. I covered that in a little bit more in an episode earlier this year, 4 essential steps to nullify federal gun control. I will link to that in the show notes. It's very important for us to actually get these first essential steps, which includes some state and local action, but of course, individual action, because ultimately, just like I was saying, what's most important is that the people have to learn how to and be willing to exercise their rights, whether the government gives them a permission slip or not. Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it in 1774. This is a paraphrase, but he said, "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate." Nothing helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people every single day than the financial faith and support of our members. It starts out at just $2 a month. Please don't feel any obligation to join us. We've got over 10,000 articles and blogs on our website. I've been doing this show for 4+ years now. We're going to continue making this information available for free. But if you want us to reach more people, put out more content and the like, and do more activism, $2 a month really can help make a difference over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Before I look over our questions and comments in the live chat, I just want to give a huge shout out and a massive thank you to just a handful of the people who have joined us as members recently. There's Karen in Nevada, Joseph in North Carolina, Richard in New Hampshire, Miles in Hawaii, that's cool, Elisa in Massachusetts. Thank you all so much. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members if you'd like to join in with them. And I'm going to pull up this Jefferson one because this quote is so important. "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate." It's not a permission slip from your local sheriff. It is not waiting for a court to tell you, a federal court to tell you that the federal government did something wrong. It's not waiting for the executive branch to stop doing or start doing anything. It's not about getting Congress to start or stop doing anything. Of course, we want them to start and stop. We want them to stop doing the stuff they're not supposed to do, but they'll never stop as long as people continue to comply. You cannot comply your way out from under the largest government in history. Let me take a look over in the live chat. Ruben Hanna, "I'm a free man because I choose to be, not because I was given permission." That's exactly what Jefferson is talking about. Dickinson as well asked in his Letters from a Farmer from Pennsylvania against the hated Townshend Acts of 1767, he asked, who are a free people? And again, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, you're not a free people if you just happen to live under a government who isn't violating your rights. You are a free people when government is so checked and controlled that as soon as it tries to, it gets stopped. So that's very, very important. Let's see what else we have here that if I can respond to any comments or questions. Liberty Revolutionary is talking about regulation. Most of the terms talking about how they've kind of manipulated the term regulated in the Constitution. They've certainly manipulated necessary and proper and what commerce. Basically, this is what we were told all along what happened. John Williams, John Dickinson, so many others told us that ingenious men will have power and they will look at the power in front of them and they will certainly always look at phrases, especially those that might be ambiguous or confusing or something that people don't understand, and they will define them in their own way to expand their own power all the time. Taking a look a little further, scrolling through, Liberty says the ATF claims they put together a registry because their floor collapsed from the weight of almost 1,044,73 forms. I saw something about that from Gun Owners of America over on Twitter, but I did not follow through on that. Liberty, if you've got a link to that, post that in the chat or DM me over on Twitter or email, whatever works best. If we can't audit, someone's talking about ballots. I'm not really looking into that. Americans just need to nut up and put their money where their mouths are. From my cold, dead hands means nothing when not acted upon. It really is up to the people to have the willingness to live free despite the fact that government does not want them to. I hope It's not necessarily something that's easy for a lot of people to do, but this is what the founding generation told us over and over and over. Whether it was Dickinson, whether it was John Hancock, again, against the Stamp Act, he said a letter to his London agent, and he said, the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. Again, they will not submit to it, and that's how they stay free. And then at the time of ratification, people like James Iredell, another one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court, he specifically said, well, you're going to find usurpation in every form of government. He was responding to people who were saying, the way this is set up, we might have some exercise of power that's not going to be good. And he's like, no matter what we put together, we're going to find usurpation. But the key to defeating usurpation, according to Iredell, was the people will resist if the government exercises powers or usurps powers not delegated to it. Mercy Otis Warren told us, resist the first approaches of tyranny. James Otis Jr. told us over and over and over, if we do not resist at the first attack, it may soon be too late. Again, it's up to the people to learn how to exercise their rights, no matter which team is violating those rights, and they all do all the time. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it's educational. I know it's not good news on any front, but it's important that we're all aware of what's happening and some steps that we need to start taking. I think the episode that I'm going to link to, the 4 essential steps to nullify federal gun control, that's really one of the most important ones we've done all year. Again, I will link to that in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There are a few other things. If you can't afford to join us as a member or you're not ready to throw some loot our way, we will take that fiat money and we will fight the empire with it. But if you're not ready to do that, you can also smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, continue leaving comments, sharing links. All that stuff will trigger the algorithms of these mainstream platforms and tell them to show us to more people. It helps out a great deal. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me this evening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. And again, we'll be back to our regular time, Friday morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. I hope you'll join me and have a great rest of the week. Till then, thanks for being here.